Hello everybody, it's Gordon Stone and Mark McNamee here. We're the two core people behind the Northern Beef Business Mentoring Program and a lot of the information delivery and education and engagement and mentoring that happens around that program. There are people listening in, I know, by phone and others with their laptops or computers. So for those of you who are watching the PowerPoints, there'll be a bit of movement in the PowerPoints this afternoon because in keeping with our focus on creating high-performing, self-managing and profitable beef businesses, it's a really critical thing for us to understand where the value lies in the value chain. And during this discussion this afternoon, you'll hear much about the concept of customers, and we've dealt with that in a previous webinar, which people are most welcome to obtain a copy of from us if they don't already have it. So Mark, I presume you're there. Welcome.
Yep, thanks Gordon. Hello everyone.
Good, thanks for everyone. Look, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Up in the top right hand corner, if you're on your computer, you'll see the screen which gives you instructions. We're very aware of download speeds and all those other things to do with internet in the bush. And so we keep this deliberately really simple, minimising questions, although you always have the opportunity to type a question in, and Dave will be monitoring the questions in the background, and depending on how we go for time, we'll answer some of those questions as well. So let's just get started. As I said, this topic is all about value in the value chain. And there may be some people listening in, as is always and is often the case, who will be thinking, is there a silver bullet in this whole concept of value in the value chain? So I guess what we're proposing this afternoon is some consideration of these ideas and relating them back to your own personal business so you can make an assessment of how it sits for you. So we'll be dealing with some quite high-level concepts, and we'll be aiming to bring it right back to specifics wherever we possibly can. So what's our focus? We actually want to describe firstly the value. To do that, we have to think about who the value is focused on and where the value might come from. In other words, what customer wants what product to do what. We see, and which is the purpose of this afternoon's webinar, that there are some unfolding trends that it's important that people understand in the overall marketplace, not only for the beef industry, but for the agri sector, in fact, for all businesses. Those trends are actually shifting, and we'll provide some data on where they're heading to, and this is going to influence how we who currently do our business a certain way might think of value in the future. So ultimately at the end of this we'll have a bit of a brainstorming session about where that value proposition lies. What does value mean? So let's get moving. We always start any one of our programs thinking about the business rather than the production side of the operation of the enterprise. And so I use this many times, but if you think of the analogy of the goodies in the yolk of the egg, that's the production side. If you think of the egg shell, we always look at that as being the critical part of the value of the business is the engagement with the product, with the market, with the high value customer who's prepared to pay. To do that though, we need to have a clear picture of where our business is going. That requires often a different way of thinking, particularly as we look at the next 10 years about how we might engage in certain high value customers, how we talk the same language with them. To do any of these sorts of things is about creating a high performing business, which is always focused on the question about where is the money. It's focused on who we can get in terms of our team to help leverage the time and expertise that we already have. And the most logical way of doing that is taking a systematic approach and creating systems. And for those people who have best management practice or benchmarking or organics or any of those areas, systems are the absolute gold that bind it together. Inevitably, and that's what this afternoon is about, we'll be thinking about risk. And as we think about value adding, we'll have to be thinking about how it is we stitch up a binding deal. So we have to understand the legalities of the process that we're heading down the track of. Potentially today we could be talking about short or long-term change. If we're thinking about longer-term or mid-term change, we might be wanting to think about succession from the point of view of business growth, business restructure, business rearrangement. To us, that's ultimately what succession is all about, and that always involves some form of value adding or leverage, and inevitably the communication and sales and marketing things fit in rethinking our whole business. So now we have to go back to the question, which is section number 1 of this presentation, the slide about what is value. Ultimately, it is indeed about the customer, because we are always focusing on the person who's prepared to pay the most, to develop and pay the most on the basis that we've established a longer-term relationship with them. Inevitably, it will be about things like quality, quantity, safety, food security, all of those sorts of things, which ultimately lead us to building a relationship. And in industry jargon, wherever you go, that's around the notion of what's called a value proposition. So the concept of how do we create value in a way in which our customer can see the value in their own terms and in their own language, around the right product in the right place for the right person. So moving on to the next slide, which is about our core principles. In one of our previous webinars that I mentioned earlier, we've actually talked about the notion of that products, markets and customers concept. And so Mark, I'm going to hand across to you to just remind us about some of these things, given we've got a couple of slides coming up, particularly about the idea of traders versus marketers and so on. So over to you.
Sure, thanks Gordon. Thinking about what I might say and just listening to how Gordon introduced today's presentation on, because today we're talking about where's the value in the value chain, and when we think about the value chain, you know, there's a number of links in it, and defining where your customer is it your customer the end user, or is the customer you know, the person who is next in the value chain? You know, there's a number of ways to look at this, and when we come to markets and when we come to looking at the value chain and where the value is in the value chain, people often go into this looking for that silver bullet that Gordon talked about. The way I want to frame the presentation today is, rather than looking for a silver bullet in a value chain, we probably need to spend our energy trying to find the nuggets rather than some sort of magical solution to, you know, improving the value that we achieve out of the market or out of our production. And you know, for most businesses, most agribusiness, most beef producers, most of the value that you're going to achieve is going to come from you know, how well you can manage cost and how well you can improve your productivity. There's no getting away from that. Those two things are going to define overall how profitable your business is going to be. But putting that aside, then we start to think about, well, how do we identify additional value in the marketplace, and then how can we tap into that? So what we do is we talk about when we're doing that, we're going to talk to customers, and we're getting customers, you know, whoever they might be, like I started with, either the end consumer or the person we're selling our production to. We go and talk to them, and we find out what it is that they're looking for. So, you know, products, any product, whether it be food or any other product, it's all about solving a problem. And to solve a customer's problem, the first thing you've got to do is find out what the problem is. And you'd be surprised that when you go and talk to customers and you start to investigate, you know, what solutions they're looking for to problems, and even where new opportunities are that you might not even know that they're investigating, you start to find these nuggets. You start to find where there's additional opportunity or additional value in the value chain. So, you know, when we have a customer-centric approach, that means that we do appreciate the fact that markets are changing. And we talk about the idea of a demographic of one. That means that rather than a mass marketing approach, for some of these unique opportunities, we're starting to identify much smaller opportunities. Might not be 100% of our production that goes into this opportunity. It might only be a very small part of our production that goes into this opportunity, but it still gives us an opportunity to improve our profitability versus just having a turnover mentality. And we talked about the idea of identifying two customers. There's the primary customer who takes what we produce off the farm, and then there's the person who consumes it. And you need to have an understanding of both parts of both customers. Once you identify that, we start to think about, well, how do we talk to these people? How do we connect our production to that customer, whether it be the primary customer or the secondary customer, the end user of your product? When we have an effective marketing plan, what we're doing, because we're focused on solving a customer's need, it makes it very difficult for them to move elsewhere. So what we do is we have a demand-driven a marketing plan rather than a push-type marketing plan. And if we think about where we are today in the beef industry, it's very much a demand-driven market, so prices are high. But rather than relying on the market to determine that, we can actually develop individual business plans that allow that to be the case on a more consistent basis. So we're not dependent necessarily on what's happening in the broader market, because, as the last point says, we develop those relationships where they're prepared to work with us through all the different cycles of the market, or cycles of beef production and just the industry, because they understand that what we're doing is we've got a very high level of service which moves across to hospitality, which is, hospitality is a higher level of service. So in terms of a customer-centric approach, and when we start to think about how we achieve or extract extra value out of any given market, certainly those 4 points are ones worthy to consider as we try to move our business in that direction. So thanks, Gordon.
Mark, yeah, thanks, Mark. And look, I'd like to add something to this conversation, particularly about the point about the two customers, and I will move on in a minute, because those who've listened to a previous webinar know that we've been down this track before. I'm sure people listening may well be aware that there is a move in the processing sector which seems to be gaining momentum, and I'm looking to understand this a bit more and make some more contacts, particularly for the people who are involved in our CEO mentoring program, about how some of the processors are actually looking at this whole question at the moment. It's a bit like a trend we saw in the supermarket not long ago, where some of the supermarkets were essentially making price-based decisions. And then ultimately suppliers to the supermarkets became frustrated because they simply weren't making the return that was required and were looking elsewhere for alternative markets. So my understanding, and this is simply my understanding at this stage, is that some of the processors are saying, in order for us to grow our business, to talk to our end customers, we actually need to build much stronger, longer term, more structured relationships with the suppliers of our beef, so that we can actually gain a much more consistent value chain, which is what this is all about. So I think stand by, because our intention is that we will dig into that in a little bit more detail once we find the right person to talk to. And so to me, that's a very valuable I guess, piece of information, which is that there is a very defined trend happening in Australia at the moment, where those processors are looking to build much stronger relationships with many of their suppliers. So let's keep moving along. We've moved on to the slide called the differentiators at the moment. So Mark, is there anything before we start to move on to some of these key trends in the marketplace that you want to add to top off this message about the customer?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Again, we've talked about this in previous webinars, so not to spend too long on it. But just looking at those two columns, some people think that it's sufficient just to address the basic needs of any potential customer or market. If you just address those four on the left-hand side of the screen, you're only addressing really the basic expectations. If you need to be dealing with those four just to have the right to play the game. That just allows you to be in that commodity-driven business. Whereas if we're going to look for these nuggets, these opportunities, what we're going to do is we're going to have to move over to those differentiators. So we're going to have to be proactive, take personal responsibility, anticipate customer needs. We're going to have a broader industry knowledge. We're going to have to focus on value and to be able to define the value that we're delivering and communicate the value to our customers. We need to seamlessly integrate our business with theirs, so we're not hard to do business with. Not only easy to do business with, but where it's actually a seamless integration, and then very much have a focus on relationship. I can't emphasize that enough, that high value business models very much depend on very deep and broad relationships to allow both parties to extract the value that's there in the operational and the marketing sense over time. So yeah, just to sum up, to say that look at those differentiators on the right hand side of the screen and see how much they're being utilised in your business.
Thanks, Mark. And I just want to recap on a number of our experiences as well when we've been speaking on behalf of some of our customers with others elsewhere in the value chain. We're always striving to build the relationship, and that's when the customers that we're building the relationship with on behalf of or with our clients are giving us the little tidbits of information which start to give us that kind of unique positioning in the marketplace. Like, we want a certain quality, we want a certain quantity, we want it long term, we like the story that you've got to tell. How do you think you could go about, so this is the customer talking to us, how do you think your client could actually go about supplying that to us at the right price, which is not necessarily going to be the cheapest price? And that's, from our perspective, that's the sort of conversation that we want to have. It only comes about as a result of the relationships. And I guess I reiterate the observation I made earlier, pardon me, that some of the processes, which I don't understand the full intricacies of that at the moment, are increasingly looking to have that conversation with their suppliers. So as we now move on to section 2 of this webinar about some of the key trends that might affect value, we do have to understand that marketplace more, understand the value chain, and understand which customers play in what space. So for those of you who've got the PowerPoints open with you, or on a piece of paper or whatever it may be, we're now going to jump forward a couple of slides because we're actually going to look at what I've called the PowerPoints in the input and output chain. So bear with me if we just jump ahead and then we come back. So for those of you who do have your slides, we're now looking at the PowerPoint in the input-output chain slide. So this is an extremely busy slide. It came from a conversation that I had with Phil Riven, who is the founder of a business strategy company that operates globally and commenced in Australia called Ibis World. And I've known Phil for probably close to 20 years, and he's been able to, I guess, predict with some degree of certainty things that are going on. For example, in the 90s, I remember him observing that the age of outsourcing household chores like washing your dog, mowing your lawn, would become a reality within 10 years. Further down the track, observing that things like people would be drinking more and more coffee in outdoor settings and eating out all the time would become the norm rather than the exception. So I guess if we think of it along these lines, his observation is, and I think it's probably best if I simply paraphrase the conversation with Phil, leading up to the 1960s, we concluded the industrial age. Moving forward from the 1960s, and we're right in the middle of it now, is what he's called the new infotronics age, which is that the top arrow. What does that mean in a bigger and broader sense? It means that people have got information. It means that everybody in the value chain, which you can see here, has got information. So information is one thing. The reason that we stressed the importance of relationships earlier in this presentation is it's the relationships that become the king. So information, as I said, is one thing. Using the relationships to apply the information is a completely different thing. So what is really the take-home message from this slide? Firstly, life is changing, and the infotronics age that we're in the middle of now will continue over the next 20 years to become stronger and stronger. So more information, more relationships, more connections, a stronger focus on vertical integration and alliances throughout the value chain so that people can extract the most value from each component of the value chain. So what do those two arrows tell us? They tell us that in the earlier days, in the industrial age, the power in the relationship resided with the people who produced the product. The power today resides in those people who've got the relationship with the customer. And the people who have the most power are the ones who can be the most nimble, who can actually see what is occurring in the marketplace and can change and rearrange themselves. So here we have a value chain which is linear, so it starts from production through to manufacturing, some importation, wholesaling, retailing, and engaging with the customer wherever they may be in the domestic or the global marketplace. In reality though, the power really does lie with those people who engage with the customer. So the observation that Phil made to me is now is the time when people need to think about where they fit in the value chain, where the power fits in the value chain, how they can engage somehow in the most powerful elements of the value chain, which ultimately are that engagement with the customer at a retail level or a wholesale level, depending on who the customer is. So I guess I just wanted to explain that before we went back a couple of slides and worked through some of the unfolding scenarios globally and locally. Mark, before we move back, any comments that you'd like to add to what I've talked about with this, this slide?
Again, only just to emphasise that, you know, identifying who your customer is really important. So, you know, if you're dealing with someone who would be a processor, so therefore it fits in that manufacturing, you know, quadrant there, you know, the same principle applies. If you're dealing with the end user, so a consumer of your product, but you're using, you know, the manufacturing, the wholesaling link and the retailing link in between you and the customer, you got to look at that as being almost a subcontractor or a partner in the process. It's really important that we do spend some time identifying exactly who our customer is and that we build this relationship that Gordon's talking about and invest in that relationship that Gordon's talking about with that identified customer. And it could be a number of people at once. It might not be the whole, you know, just your whole production's going into one relationship. So, you know, certainly moving forward, it's going to get more complicated, and knowing who to talk to and how to talk to them is going to be really important in ensuring, you know, your business is successful moving forward.
Thanks, Mark. And the reason we've jumped to this slide and the reason that we're having the conversation today the way we are is that we're very well aware that in order for a person to change their beef production enterprise, it's not something you can do overnight. And to make some changes, they actually have to be very much educated changes. Or if they're going to be some areas of fine-tuning, they're still going to take a period of time. So that's what I guess number one, to understand longer term what's going on. Number two, that if there are relationships that need to be built to get that market intelligence to flow back from the powerful ends of the value chain, which is that consumer, retailing, wholesaling component, then those relationships also, if they don't exist now, are not necessarily built overnight. So it's important to identify which relationships with whom and start the process of relationship building to get that market intelligence to flow back so that we can make changes, whatever they may be. So I'm going to head back a couple of slides now so that we can actually create the context for this conversation. So why do we have this slide up here, and why do we talk about 2016 as being our starting position? All will be revealed in the next slide, but there are some important things here to summarise. Number one, the big economic region globally is in the Asia Pacific, in which we reside. 30% of our beef production is domestic or goes to the domestic market, 70% goes to the export market or thereabouts, depending on how things unfold. So if we think of the big consumption areas, they are indeed in our own region, the Asia Pacific. They're also in North America. And so if we think of the Asia Pacific, then we have a degree of consistency, particularly through the ASEAN countries, in how we do business with those countries. So there is a degree of similarity, some more so than others. Then we have North America as an area or continent that's very aligned with ourselves as well. And we have a degree of very high net worth customers there who are increasingly seeking a product that we can supply. And I think the only other point for us to observe here is that our current world GDP is 118 trillion, and as we move to the next slide we'll see what that growth is likely to be over the next decade. So Mark, before we move on, anything to add to this?
Yeah, the only point, sometimes I look at this sort of information and I say, well, okay, how does that relate to me as a beef producer in the Lockyer Valley? It can seem a little bit disconnected. What I'd like those listening to think about is that we're actually just throwing up an example of what this means when we're talking about the supply chain, extracting value in the supply chain. This is just one marker. It's kind of like an example. But you could be looking at a domestic opportunity, and rather than having the market segmented into North America, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, blah, 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 you could segment your market up into direct sales. You could come up with your own market segments and work out where the growth opportunities are, and then start to think about, okay, who's in that value chain that I need to be talking to. So, while we are talking about this sort of global picture, what we're really trying to do is to emphasise the principles involved in how you manage or how you create this value in any value chain. It's just a really nice way of explaining it in relatively straightforward terms.
Thanks, Mark. Look, before we move on to the next slide, I'd like to maybe observe a component of the business mentoring program that we haven't really touched on so far. During the CEO mentoring program, which is a longer term component of the program, so it goes over 12 months, it consists of a number of two-day workshops, 3 two-day workshops during the year, and individual work and connection with mentors every month. The reason that is so valuable when you're looking at these sorts of slides is to say, well, maybe early in the piece, if I'm thinking about changing, where do I start my thinking? And I would put it like this, that it's always important to have a sense of how the crystal ball might look in the future. Inevitably, the future will change. However, what we're trying to do is, from a probability perspective, get a sense of where things might end up. And potentially, being in the beef industry, we are potentially a high growth opportunity in the global marketplace. And rather than being a commodity market, the potential increasingly is to become involved in more niche markets that have added value, which is what this whole conversation is all about. So I wanted to set that up because this is actually part of thinking about the mega trends. So speaking of some of these mega trends then, as we look at what might happen with the importance of these regions, we observed that we had 118 million GDP, so they're, you know, big picture figures and all of those sorts of things. But what do we see as we look at the world in 2025? Essentially, we see that there'll be continued growth in the Asia Pacific. There'll be some minor contraction in North America. We see other growth opportunities, particularly in some of those other areas, such as you know, the Indian subcontinent, Africa, Middle East, and so on. But the question that we then have to ask ourselves is, what does that mean for us? And what's the degree of difficulty in dealing with any of those markets? And we in future programs like this will start to dig down into some of the detail of how each of these markets look, and we'll start to examine, say, the domestic market in Australia, the high value market in the US, some of the Asian markets such as Malaysia and others which have potential growth opportunities for us, and examine how it is that we can add or extract value through the whole process. And it may simply be choosing the processor who is going places, or alternatively it may be spreading our risk into say dealing direct with butchers or whatever else it may be, or ultimately looking at direct dealings with customers if we're prepared to look at service kills and various other things along those lines. Or indeed, if we want economies of scale, to engage with other like-minded individuals to start creating whatever economies of scale are required as we look at some of these megatrends. So Mark, anything else to add?
Well, the only number that jumps off the page here for me is, yeah, we say Asia Pacific is going to grow by 36, going to be 36% of the global, world GDP, but it's of $190 trillion. I mean, there is going to be some money sloshing around in buckets in some places very close to us. So what comes to mind is I remember getting off the plane to Hong Kong for the first time, I don't know, too many years ago, and I could just hear that money roll around in that city, and it looks like that just is going to go and continue to grow, and we're just very fortunate if we do it well because of our proximity to those markets, and it's something we should keep an eye on, I think.
Sure. And look, it's good you used Hong Kong as an analogy too, Mark, because there's somebody I know quite well who's involved in the hospitality sector in Hong Kong, and what do they most want? They actually most want high quality Australian product because it's safe and secure. It's got a global perception as being a high value product to eat, with all those safety and food security issues around it, very much sought after. So if we're thinking about, examining our markets, those are the sort of things that we have to look at and say, is it for me? And if it is for me, well, how do I get there? And is it logistically achievable? And if it is, let's get started. Righto, let's move on. So we've now moved to the PowerPoints in the input-output chain. So there's probably not much else to tell there, apart from now that we've created the context, we have to ask ourselves if the most power sits with the retailing sector or the wholesaling sector because they engage with the customers, or some of those high value niches like food service or whatever else it may be. The question for us from a value chain point of view is, how can we examine where and how to get a slice of that action? So it's almost that we've asked another question, but in these kind of business development conversations, often it is about asking the right question and then go and examining the answer, or finding the answer and examining what it reveals. So Mark, before we move on, anything else to add?
No, thanks.
Okay, so now we're getting into the slide number 3 about key questions around value. So these are questions that we're suggesting that people start to pose for themselves. And so this is an intensely personal conversation about what is my current product, what other products am I capable of producing, who might the customer be that I might decide to focus on, And is it simply building that stronger relationship, say, with my current processor, or examining other processes, or examining some way in which I can deal direct with a customer? The next point there we talk about is understanding those wants, needs and key drivers of customers, because basically we will always encourage people who participate in our programs to stand in the customer's shoes. And we do something strange, which is called consider yourself Steve. So let's say Steve is the CEO of that high-value hospitality setting in Hong Kong. Or let's say Steve is the purchasing manager of the processor that I habitually deal with. How can I understand more of what Steve's needs are? How can I ask Steve the right question about what it is that he needs that I may well be able to produce? Because he may have just thought of me up until this point as a number, rather than a real person who can help him solve a problem that he has. And that might lead us to the third dot point there, which is the question about how can I add value? It may simply be the story about our business, because we know, for example, that supermarkets and even butchers and people, you know, who are in the restaurant trade in Brisbane are constantly wanting to tell the story of where their product came from. Who are the people behind the product? What's the story around those people? On the other hand, you know, we've also had some opportunities to be involved in things like adding value through packaging. I had a conversation with somebody at one of the forums I was at yesterday who said, I really hate the idea of all this packaging going into landfill. The reality is, though, that many of our customers are actually wanting safe, secure, packaged food to assure them that they are indeed eating the high-quality food that they thought they were going to eat. So, Mark, we're about to move on to our next slide about being remarkable, which is one of your catch cries. Anything you want to add about the value concept before I ask you to deal with that slide?
Just that you can't do this stuff sitting on a quad bike. If what we're talking about here is this is about running the business, it's about working on the business, not working in the business. And taking the opportunity to step away from what you do on a day-to-day basis and think through some of this stuff is very important. And it's just as productive as doing what you have to do every day. It can build your business just as effectively.
So the objective is to become the outsider looking in. So that's agreed. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Let's just whistle. I'm very aware of time, so let's just whistle through this next slide. Anything you really want to bring to people's attention?
No, just ask them to write down, you know, what it means to be remarkable, and then maybe run that as a ruler up against, you know, their own operation and what they do every day. Point number 6 is really important. So too many people let fear run their business. Well, they let fear run their life, and you know, there's a lot of things. Maybe you've got an underperforming staff member, and you might say to yourself, well, yeah, sure, they're not very good, but if I let them go, what's that going to cost me? You know, I'll just have to work harder, and that's not the way to run your business. Certainly from a market perspective, you know, it's a fear shouldn't stop us adapting and evolving when we have to. And the last point, point 7, get really good at telling your story. If you're going to extract value from the value chain, you know, you've got to take responsibility for that. And so being able to tell your story, or to have a story to tell, and then developing the skills to be able to communicate it, it's really important, because that's what's going to tell everyone that you're remarkable. And we've got some really remarkable beef production operations in Australia. I'm telling you, it's what we do here is second to none, and we just got to get better at telling people how good we are. It's not, we don't feel comfortable doing that as Australians, but it's certainly something a skill we've got to develop. So that's all I'd say on that slide, Gordon.
Thanks, Mark. Well, look, that's a very good slide, depending on how people are thinking about the concept of value to regroup and recap on, because our whole focus in all of our programs is how to get people to think about their unique selling distinction, that USD, and how they can establish themselves as being remarkable to do business with. So we're starting to draw things to a close now, so we're on slide 4, thinking about value. So I know we've been banging the drum a lot about customers. We've brought into the equation the conversation about standing out in our customer's shoes, the hypothetical customer called Steve. The reason we're doing that is because we want to stand in Steve's shoes and work out how they see value. It may be monetary value, it might be quality, it might be quantity, it might be relationship, it might be longevity, all of those sorts of things. And one of the other reasons that we're asking you to stand in Steve's shoes is because we have to actually articulate the value proposition. So again, we've got that jargon again, but basically the value proposition is about what value I can add to somebody else's business so I can get paid better than I do at the moment, and do that long term in a way in which we're all talking the same language. So the idea of the value proposition is a bit like a business plan, or some of that the work that's happening in the CEO mentoring program, which is getting really clear about where we're going to from here, and making it so clear that we can articulate that in a short, sharp sentence or two, so that Steve says, got it, I want to do business with you, and let's talk about money at the end of the conversation, not the beginning. So that's what the final point is about, is establishing that win-win so that we all win, and that may ultimately be the end user of the product as well. So Mark, before we draw things to a close, anything else to add?
No, just be enthusiastic. One of the things that we, as a beef industry, we're on a high at the moment. It's quite solid in terms of its outlook. The whole idea of the mentoring program that that we're inviting people to participate in is to start to think about, well, things aren't going to be like this all the time, and so how can we capitalise on the opportunity that sits before us now, so that as we move forward we don't have to have the struggles that we've gone through in previous years. Yes, there's some stuff we can't control around weather and markets, but what we're talking about here is there something we can do differently in terms of how we engage with the value chain that in some way, shape or form will reduce our exposure and therefore the consequences that come from those changing conditions. And we look forward to talking and working with those people participating in the program on how they might do that. So yeah, Gordon, that's how I'd like to wrap things up from my end.
Thanks, Mark. So moving on, we always recap at the end about what this business mentoring program is about. So you've participated today in some of our business updates, a sense on what's going on in the marketplace, and we'll be dealing soon with money and dealing with other business management and business wider business thinking about people and so on. We also run our one-day beef business workshops, and its whole purpose is to start doing that stock take, become the outsider looking in and make a true assessment of where we are now and where we want to be, and then work out, most importantly, how we get there. Because the most difficult thing is we can have the good idea, but the purpose of the CEO mentoring program is to help people implement change around the 12 pillars that we dealt with earlier today. So there'll be people like Mark and myself, some of our specialists and others who will be having those roundtable conversations. Not much else to add as we draw things right to a close. I observe though that towards the bottom of this slide here, we're talking about the subsidised attendance fees this year. So I've already, I think, described that this program is a joint exercise between ourselves, Meat and Livestock Australia and their donor company, AgForce in Queensland, and the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in Queensland as well. The reason that they want this program to occur is to provide support and assistance to people in the beef industry. And I guess when we talk about these subsidised attendance fees, it's important to understand that if you break it all right down, it's a cost in the vicinity of $250 a month to participate in a program like this. that we always ask is, if that's a night at the pub, or a good meal at a restaurant with the family, or something along those lines, that's one concept of value. The other concept of, if you break it down to something like $250 a month, is if that's going to help build a far, far more valuable business that gives you much more peace of mind, eases your frustration, provides the opportunity for you to hand on another higher performing business to others, maybe think of it in those terms. So finally, inevitably you know how to get in touch with us. Once again, we make the offer that if anyone wants to talk to myself or Mark, our phone numbers are there. Just simply give us a ring and say that you are on this call and that you want to have a chat about what's going on. So thank you all for attending. Mark, thank you once again for your support. Dave, I noticed that there's a few questions there that you've observed, so we'll be using them to create subsequent webinars from here. So Mark, are we all done?
Yes, thanks, Gordon.
And thank you all for attending once again. We hope that you found this of some value. Please give us any feedback that you'd like to, and you will all find that there will be a pop-up screen that will come up at the end of this, which will actually ask you about giving us some feedback. It's quite important from the point of view of making sure this hits the mark. It's quite important for us to give some feedback to those people who are putting the money on the table to help make all of this happen for you. So once again, everybody, thank you very much for attending. We appreciate you doing so. Look forward to some feedback. Look forward to talking to you soon. Bye for now.